The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine courtyard of the National Defense Headquarters as Minister Charles Whitman stepped out of his black sedan. The vehicle's engine ticked softly as it cooled, the only sound breaking the disciplined silence of the morning guard formation. At 62, Whitman carried himself with the practiced confidence of a man who had spent 30 years climbing the political ladder, each rung carefully calculated to bring him closer to real power. His expensive Italian suit was perfectly tailored to his slightly overweight frame, his silver hair impeccably styled by the same barber who had served 3 previous defense ministers, and his leather briefcase bore the embossed seal of his high office in gold lettering that caught the morning light. Whitman had been appointed as Minister of Defense just 6 months ago, a reward for his loyal service to the ruling party and his exceptional skills in political fundraising. During his confirmation hearings, he had promised to bring fiscal responsibility and modern business practices to what he called an antiquated military structure. Unlike his predecessor, General Patricia Hayes, who had 35 years of military experience, including combat command, Whitman came from a background in corporate law and political fundraising. Had never worn a uniform, never heard a shot, fired in anger, and never lost sleep worrying about soldiers under his command. He viewed the military through the lens of spreadsheets and budget projections rather than tradition and honor, seeing personnel as human resources to be managed rather than warriors to be respected. The Royal Guards stood at attention along the entrance pathway, their scarlet uniforms pristine despite the early morning dew that had settled on everything else. Their brass buttons gleamed like small suns, and their black boots reflected the stone pathway beneath them. These weren't ordinary soldiers playing dress-up for tourists or ceremonial window dressing for government buildings. They were elite military personnel, selected through a rigorous process that examined not only their exceptional service records, but also their unwavering dedication to duty and their ability to represent the finest traditions of their nation's military. Each man and woman in that formation had served multiple tours in active combat zones before earning the honor of joining the ceremonial guard, and each carried scars both visible and invisible from their service. Sergeant Major James Fletcher had been with the Royal Guard for 8 years, longer than any other current member of the unit. His chest bore ribbons from 3 different conflicts spanning nearly 2 decades of continuous service. The blue and silver ribbon represented his service in Afghanistan, where he had led convoy security operations through some of the most dangerous territory in the country. The Bronze Star, with Combat V, spoke of his actions in Iraq, where he had single-handedly held a defensive position for 6 hours, while his unit evacuated wounded civilians from a bombed marketplace. The Purple Heart ribbon was actually 2 ribbons, sewn together, representing wounds received in Syria when his unit was ambushed while providing humanitarian aid to refugees. Fletcher's weathered hands told stories of battles fought in distant lands under scorching suns and freezing mountain winds. His right hand bore a long scar from shrapnel that had torn through his glove during a mortar attack outside Kandahar. His left ring finger was slightly crooked from being broken during hand-to-hand combat with an enemy soldier who had infiltrated their base camp. At 45, he had seen enough war to understand the true meaning of service and sacrifice in ways that most people could never comprehend. His dark eyes held the quiet intensity of a man who had looked death in the face countless times and never flinched, who had made split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for his soldiers. Standing beside Fletcher was Corporal Sarah Chen, one of only 3 women to earn a place in the Royal Guard during its 150-year history. Her small frame, barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, belied her incredible strength and determination that had carried her through Ranger training and 3 combat deployments. She had fought alongside men twice her size in the desert campaigns, and earned their respect not through political correctness or diversity quotas, but through courage under fire and an unwavering commitment to her fellow soldiers. Her black hair was pulled back in a regulation bun that never showed a single strand out of place, and her stance was as solid as granite despite weighing barely 120 pounds. Chen's story was legendary among military personnel. During her second deployment, she had carried a wounded soldier twice her size nearly 2 miles through enemy territory after their patrol was ambushed. She She had fought off 3 separate attacks during that journey. Using her sidearm, and eventually her knife, when ammunition ran out, the soldier she saved was now a lieutenant colonel. And he still credited her with not only saving his life, but teaching him what real courage looked like. The other guards in the formation each had similar stories of valor and sacrifice. Private First Class Miguel Torres had lost his left leg below the knee to an improvised explosive device, but had fought through. 18 months of rehabilitation to remain on active duty rather than accept a medical discharge. Sergeant David Williams had been captured during a reconnaissance mission gone wrong and spent 8 months as a prisoner of war, enduring torture and deprivation while never revealing classified information that could have endangered other soldiers. Corporal Jennifer Hayes, no relation to the former defense minister, had been awarded the Silver Star for leading a rescue mission that saved 12 civilians trapped in a collapsed building during an earthquake relief operation. These were warriors who had earned their place through blood, sweat, and unwavering commitment to their country and their fellow soldiers. They understood that their current role, while ceremonial in nature, represented something far greater than themselves. They were living symbols of military excellence and national pride, representatives of every man and woman who had ever worn the uniform in service to their nation. Their presence at the defense headquarters wasn't just about tradition or pageantry. It was about maintaining a connection between the political leadership and the human cost of the decisions made in those halls of power. Minister Whitman barely glanced at the guards as he approached the building. His mind already focused on the morning's agenda of budget meetings and personnel reviews. In his mind, they were expensive decorations, costly remnants of an outdated system that consumed budget resources better spent on modern technology and administrative efficiency. He had already made preliminary notes about potentially reducing their numbers or replacing them entirely with less expensive private security personnel, who could provide the same basic functions without the significant cost of maintaining elite military personnel in ceremonial roles. During his first week in office, Whitman had questioned why the government needed to spend nearly $2 million annually on what he termed military theater. He had suggested that the money would be better spent on updated computer systems, or additional civilian analysts who could provide more practical value to the Defense Department's operations. His staff had tried to explain the historical significance and morale value of the Royal Guard, but Whitman saw only numbers on a balance sheet. The guards had heard whispers about the new minister's attitudes toward military tradition through the informal network that connected all military personnel. Word traveled fast through the ranks about politicians who viewed soldiers as expendable resources rather than human beings who had sacrificed everything for their country. They had served under previous ministers who, regardless of their political affiliations, had at least shown respect for their service and understood the significance of military traditions. The contrast with Minister Whitman was becoming increasingly clear with each passing week. Several of the guards had already received inquiries from other units about potential transfers. As rumors circulated that the ceremonial guard might be disbanded entirely, the prospect of losing their positions wasn't what concerned them. They were all qualified for many other assignments. What troubled them was the message it would send about how military service was valued by the current civilian leadership. As Whitman reached the main entrance of the imposing stone building, he paused and turned toward the formation of guards with a deliberate movement that suggested this wasn't a casual glance. Something in his expression, a combination of calculation and barely concealed disdain, suggested this wasn't going to be a routine morning inspection or a simple acknowledgement of their presence. The guards could sense a shift in the atmosphere, the way experienced soldiers always could when a situation was about to change from routine to significant. Minister Whitman surveyed the line of guards with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating assets rather than acknowledging human beings who had devoted their lives to serving their country. He had spent the previous evening reviewing personnel files and budget allocations, but not to understand the individual stories of service and sacrifice represented in the formation before him. Instead, he had been looking for ways to justify his growing conviction that the ceremonial unit was an expensive anachronism that drained resources from more practical military needs. His understanding of military protocol was purely academic, gleaned from briefing documents and policy manuals rather than lived experience or genuine respect for military tradition. He knew that as Minister of Defense, he technically outranked everyone present, including decorated combat veterans with decades of service. More importantly, he understood that his position gave him control over budgets, assignments, and career advancement for every person in uniform. He intended to use that authority to make a point about civilian supremacy and fiscal responsibility. The morning air was crisped with the promise of autumn, and a light breeze rustled the ceremonial flags that hung from poles around the courtyard. The sound was subtle, but distinct in the disciplined silence maintained by the guard formation. Other government officials and staff members moved in and out of the imposing stone building, their footsteps echoing off the polished floors and marble columns inside. Many of these early arrivals paused to observe what appeared to be an impromptu inspection taking place on the front steps. Among the observers gathering at a respectful distance was Deputy Secretary Margaret Collins, a career civil servant who had worked with 4 different defense ministers over the past 12 years. She had seen the transition from military leadership to civilian oversight before, but never quite like this. Something in Minister Whitman's body language and the tension evident in the guard formation suggested this was more than a routine interaction between civilian and military leadership. Sergeant Major Fletcher maintained his position at the center of the formation, his eyes fixed straight ahead as military discipline demanded. But his peripheral vision took in every detail of the minister's approach and demeanor. Fletcher had served under 7 different commanding officers during his career, from battlefield commanders who led from the front to rear-echelon officers who managed logistics and supply chains. He had learned to read people quickly and accurately, a skill that had kept him and his soldiers alive during multiple combat deployments. The sergeant major could sense something different in the minister's approach today, something that set his trained instincts on edge. There was an arrogance in Whitman's posture, a smugness that seemed inappropriate for the solemnity of the setting. More concerning was the minister's obvious disregard for the significance of the ribbons and decorations displayed on the guards' uniforms. Each ribbon represented months or years of service in dangerous conditions, yet Whitman looked at them as if they were costume jewelry. Rather than symbols of sacrifice and valor, Fletcher's own ribbon rack told a story of nearly 2 decades of continuous service in the world's most dangerous places. The combat infantry badge above his ribbons indicated that he had served in ground combat operations, where he had engaged enemy forces directly. The expert infantry badge below showed that he had mastered not only combat skills, but also the technical and tactical knowledge required to train other soldiers. The Ranger tab on his left shoulder meant he had completed one of the military's most grueling training programs, while the Special Forces tab indicated advanced training in unconventional warfare and special operations. Whitman stopped directly in front of Fletcher, positioning himself close enough that his expensive cologne mixed with the crisp morning air in an almost offensive way. The scent was heavy and artificial, a stark contrast to the clean, disciplined atmosphere maintained by the military personnel around him. He looked the sergeant major up and down, like he was inspecting a piece of equipment rather than addressing a decorated war veteran whose service record included 3 Bronze Star medals and 2 Purple Hearts. The minister's inspection was deliberately slow and condescending, his eyes lingering on details in a way that suggested judgment rather than appreciation. He noted Fletcher's perfectly pressed uniform, the precise alignment of his ribbons and badges, and the mirror-like shine on his black leather boots. But instead of recognizing these details as signs of professional pride and military bearing, Whitman seemed to view them as evidence of excessive attention to meaningless ceremony. Sergeant Major Whitman began, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question or delay. "I've been reviewing the protocols and procedures for this unit during my first few months in office. It seems to me that there's been a concerning lack of proper respect for civilian authority and an overemphasis on military tradition that may be inappropriate." In the current political climate, the words hung in the air like a challenge, and every guard in the formation could feel the tension building around them like an electrical storm gathering strength. They had all served under civilian leadership before. From field-grade officers who had earned their respect through competence and character to senior officials who understood the delicate balance between authority and respect. But never had they encountered such obvious disrespect disguised as official business. Such a blatant attempt to diminish their service and sacrifice in the name of political positioning. Fletcher's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his eyes remained fixed forward in perfect military bearing. He had faced enemy fire without flinching, had made life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure, and had never backed down from a fight when principle was at stake. But this situation required a different kind of courage, the discipline, to maintain military courtesy while defending the honor of his unit and everything they represented. "Want to make something crystal clear to everyone present?" Whitman continued, raising his voice so that all the government employees and staff members within earshot could hear his words. "In this chain of command, I am your superior officer. Military tradition and combat experience mean nothing if they don't include proper respect for those who hold the real power in this government and control the budgets that fund your operations." The statement was a deliberate insult wrapped in the language of official policy, and everyone present understood its implications. Whitman wasn't just asserting his authority, he was suggesting that respect should be based on political appointment rather than earned through service and sacrifice. He was essentially telling combat veterans that their years of dangerous service meant less than his political connections and fundraising abilities. Few of the passing government workers stopped to listen, sensing that something significant was unfolding before their eyes. Among them was General Patricia Morrison, a respected career officer who had served for 32 years and was widely regarded as one of the finest military minds of her generation. She had been walking toward her office when she heard Whitman's raised voice and recognized the tone of confrontation that she had hoped never to witness between civilian and military leadership. General Morrison had served as a young officer during the transition from conscript military to all-volunteer forces, had commanded units during 3 different conflicts, and had worked closely with civilian leadership throughout her career. She understood better than most the delicate balance required to maintain effective civil-military relations, and she could see that balance being destroyed by Whitman's arrogance and ignorance. Whitman reached into his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out a manila folder containing what appeared to be official documents with government letterhead and legal formatting. The papers rustled in the morning breeze as he opened the folder with theatrical precision, clearly intended to demonstrate his bureaucratic authority over the military personnel before him. "I've prepared new guidelines for this unit regarding proper conduct when interacting with senior civilian officials," Whitman announced, his voice growing more pompous with each word. "These guidelines emphasize the importance of showing appropriate deference to those who control military budgets, personnel decisions, and career advancement opportunities. I believe some members of this organization have forgotten who actually holds the power in this relationship." The insult was clear to everyone present, delivered with the smug satisfaction of someone who believed he held all the cards in this confrontation. Whitman was essentially saying that their respect should be bought with budget allocations and career opportunities rather than earned through leadership, character, and genuine concern for the welfare of military personnel. He was reducing the sacred trust between civilian and military leadership to a crude transaction based on power and money rather than mutual respect and shared commitment to national defense. Furthermore, Whitman continued, his voice carrying across the courtyard and drawing even more observers to witness this unprecedented confrontation, "I believe this unit has become too comfortable with their current arrangements, too confident in their perceived importance to this organization. Perhaps it's time for some significant changes that will remind everyone where true authority lies in this government. Structure." General Morrison stepped closer, her expression darkening as she realized where this confrontation was heading, and understood the potential consequences for both civilian-military relations and the careers of the soldiers being subjected to this public humiliation. She had seen politicians try to assert dominance over military personnel before, but never quite so blatantly or with such obvious malicious intent designed to demean rather than lead. Minister Whitman closed his briefcase with a sharp, metallic snap that echoed across the courtyard like a gunshot, the sound causing several nearby civilians to jump slightly. He positioned himself directly in front of the formation with the theatrical precision of someone who had clearly rehearsed this moment in his mind, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking against the stone pavement as he adjusted his stance for maximum dramatic effect. His next words would cross a line that no senior official in the history of this institution had ever dared approach, a boundary between legitimate civilian oversight and deliberate humiliation that would be remembered long after everyone present had moved on to other assignments and other lives. Morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting shorter shadows across the courtyard and illuminating the scene with harsh, unforgiving light that seemed to emphasize every detail of what was about to unfold. The temperature was rising with the sun, but there was still a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the tension building between civilian authority and military dignity. "Now then," Whitman announced loudly, his voice carrying with the practiced projection of someone accustomed to addressing large audiences and demanding their attention. "I want to demonstrate the proper relationship between civilian authority and military personnel in a way that leaves no room for misunderstanding or future confusion about the chain of command in this organization." He paused dramatically, allowing his words to hang in the air while he surveyed the faces of the government employees and military personnel who had gathered to witness this unprecedented confrontation. Some were holding smartphones, instinctively recognizing that they were about to witness something that would be talked about and analyzed for years to come. Others simply stared in fascination or horror, depending on their understanding of military culture and the significance of what they were seeing. As your superior officer and the person who ultimately controls your funding, your assignments, your promotions, and your continued employment with this organization, Whitman continued, his chest puffing with self-importance that bordered on the absurd. "I am hereby ordering this entire formation to render honors in recognition of civilian authority and as a demonstration of proper military discipline." The request itself wasn't unusual under normal circumstances. Military personnel regularly saluted senior officials as part of standard protocol established through decades of tradition and regulation. Officers and enlisted personnel alike understood the importance of showing respect for the chain of command, regardless of their personal feelings about individual leaders. But there was something in Whitman's tone and timing that made this demand feel fundamentally different from routine military courtesy. This wasn't about protocol, tradition, or even legitimate civilian oversight of military operations. This was about power and humiliation. It's about a weak man trying to assert dominance through public degradation rather than earning respect through leadership and character. Everyone present could sense the difference. Even those with no military experience could feel that something was deeply wrong with this situation. "I want every member of this formation to salute me right now," Whitman commanded, his voice rising to nearly a shout that echoed off the stone walls of the surrounding buildings. "And I want it done with the enthusiasm and respect that my position demands and that your continued employment requires, Sergeant Major." Fletcher felt every muscle in his body tense as the full implications of Whitman's demand became clear. He had saluted thousands of officers during his career, from battlefield commanders who had earned his respect through courage and wisdom displayed under enemy fire, to ceremonial officials who deserved acknowledgement of their rank and position within the military hierarchy. He had rendered honors to generals who had shared the dangers of combat with their troops and to colonels who had demonstrated genuine concern for the welfare of the soldiers under their command. But this felt fundamentally different. Wrong in a way that violated everything Fletcher understood about military honor and civilian leadership. This wasn't about military courtesy or respect for legitimate authority. This was about a politician trying to force a public display of submission from combat veterans who had sacrificed more for their country than Whitman could ever comprehend. The Other guards sensed Fletcher's hesitation and waited for his lead, as they had been trained to do in countless situations ranging from ceremonial duties to life-and-death combat operations. They trusted his judgment completely, knowing that his decisions were always based on principle rather than personal convenience or career advancement. Corporal Chen's hands remained at her sides, her mind racing through years of military training that emphasized honor and dignity above blind obedience to authority. She had saluted generals in foxholes and colonels in parade grounds, had shown respect to officers who had earned it through their actions and character. She had never hesitated to render proper military courtesy when it was appropriate and deserved. But this situation was different, and every instinct developed through years of military service told her that complying with Whitman's demand would be a betrayal of everything she had sworn to uphold when she first put on the uniform. She had taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution, not to participate in political theater designed to humiliate military personnel for the amusement of civilian officials. General Morrison watched from her position near the building entrance, her face grimmed with understanding of the larger implications of this confrontation. She recognized what Whitman was trying to do: establish dominance through public humiliation, demonstrate his power by forcing decorated combat veterans to grovel before his civilian authority. She had seen similar tactics used by weak leaders throughout her career, and she knew it always ended badly for everyone involved. The silence stretched uncomfortably across the courtyard as the guards remained motionless, their military bearing perfect, but their compliance with Whitman's order notably absent. Other government employees and military personnel had gathered to watch, some forming a loose circle around the confrontation, while others observed from windows and doorways. Cell phones were recording from multiple angles, ensuring that whatever happened next would be preserved for history and analysis. The growing audience included enlisted personnel from other units, junior officers making their way to morning briefings, civilian contractors arriving for work, and even some members of the press who had been at the building for unrelated interviews and meetings. Word was spreading rapidly through the informal networks that connected all military installations, and people were arriving specifically to witness this unprecedented clash between civilian and military authority. Whitman's face began to redden as he realized his order wasn't being immediately obeyed, his political instincts telling him that every second of delay weakened his position and undermined his authority in front of an audience that would certainly discuss this incident throughout the government and military communities. His carefully planned demonstration of civilian supremacy was turning into a public relations disaster, but his pride and arrogance prevented him from recognizing the graceful exit that was still available to him. "Did you hear me, Sergeant Major?" Whitman's voice cracked slightly with frustrated anger as he stepped even closer to Fletcher, invading the personal space of a man who had faced enemy soldiers in hand-to-hand combat without showing fear. "I gave you a direct order that requires immediate compliance. I expect instant obedience from this formation, and any delay or hesitation will be noted in your permanent records and dealt with accordingly." Fletcher finally spoke, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of decades of military experience and the quiet authority that came from leading soldiers through life-and-death situations where leadership meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "Sir, the Royal Guard renders honors according to military protocol and established tradition. We salute to show respect for rank, service, and sacrifice, not on command for public display or political demonstration." The crowd of observers stirred as they witnessed something remarkable, a masterclass in military dignity and principled leadership. Fletcher had just explained the fundamental difference between earned respect and demanded submission without directly defying the minister's authority or violating military discipline. He had stood his ground while maintaining perfect military courtesy, demonstrating the kind of moral courage that had earned him the respect of soldiers throughout his career. Whitman's eyes flashed with anger as he realized that Fletcher had just given him a lesson in leadership and dignity that exposed his own inadequacies as a leader. The sergeant major had managed to challenge his authority while maintaining military protocol, had defended the honor of his unit while showing appropriate respect for civilian oversight, and had done it all in front of an audience that would certainly remember and discuss this encounter for years to come. Protocol? Whitman's voice rose to nearly a shout. His composure completely abandoned now, as his political survival instincts warred with his wounded pride. I'll tell you what protocol is, Sergeant Major. Protocol is following orders from your superiors without argument. Delay, or philosophical discussions about the nature of respect and authority. I'm not asking for your respect or your understanding, I'm commanding. Immediate compliance with a direct order from the Minister of Defense. The tension in the courtyard reached a breaking point as Minister Whitman stepped even closer to Sergeant Major Fletcher, his expensive Italian leather shoes scraping against the stone pavement with each aggressive step forward. His face was now flushed with embarrassment and rage. The carefully controlled political demeanor he had spent decades perfecting completely abandoned in favor of raw, unfiltered anger at being challenged by someone he considered beneath his station. He had expected immediate compliance, unquestioning obedience to his authority, not a lesson in military ethics from someone he viewed as little more than a uniformed civil servant. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting harsh shadows across the scene and illuminating every detail of what was rapidly becoming one of the most significant confrontations between civilian and military leadership in the institution's long history. The temperature was rising, but the chill in the air seemed to deepen with each passing moment as more observers gathered to witness this unprecedented clash of authority and principle. "You're testing my patience," Sergeant Major Whitman hissed through clenched teeth, his voice low but carrying clearly in the disciplined silence of the morning air. His words dripped with the kind of barely controlled fury that came from a man unaccustomed to having his authority questioned, especially in such a public and humiliating manner. "I have the authority to end your career with a single phone call. I can transfer this entire formation to the most remote, miserable posts in the military system. I can ensure that your service records reflect insubordination and disrespect for civilian authority. Is that really the hill you want to die on?" The threat hung in the air like a toxic cloud, its implications clear to everyone present. Whitman wasn't just asserting his administrative authority. He was threatening to destroy the careers and livelihoods of soldiers who had risked their lives in service to their country. He was using his political power as a weapon against men and women whose only crime was maintaining their dignity and professional standards in the face of deliberate humiliation. Fletcher remained perfectly still, but his response was immediate and delivered with the kind of quiet conviction that could only come from someone who had faced far worse threats than career destruction. His voice carried the weight of nearly 2 decades of military service, of battles fought and soldiers lost, of principles tested under fire and never found wanting. "Sir, I've already been to those remote, miserable posts you're threatening me with," Fletcher replied, his words measured and calm despite the gravity of the situation unfolding around him. "I've served in places where good soldiers die for causes they believe in, where the only thing that matters is whether you can look your fellow warriors in the eye and know you've never compromised your honor or betrayed their trust." He paused for a moment, allowing his words to sink in before continuing with quiet dignity. "I've earned my rank through service to my country and my soldiers, not through political appointments or budget negotiations. I've led men and women through situations where leadership meant the difference between life and death, where respect had to be earned through courage and competence rather than demanded through threats and intimidation." A murmur rippled through the growing crowd of observers as they witnessed something remarkable. A combat veteran calmly explaining the fundamental difference between legitimate authority and mere political power. Fletcher had just delivered what amounted to a devastating critique of Whitman's qualifications and character without technically showing disrespect to his office or violating military protocol. The crowd had grown, significantly larger now, with people arriving from throughout the building and even from nearby government offices as word spread about the confrontation taking place on the front steps of the defense headquarters. Among the observers were junior officers who looked up to Fletcher as a mentor and role model. senior enlisted personnel who had served alongside him in various assignments, and civilian employees who had worked with the Royal Guard for years and understood their exceptional character and dedication. Corporal Chen and the other guards remained motionless in their formation, but their solidarity with Fletcher was unmistakable to anyone who understood military culture and the bonds forged between soldiers who had served together in dangerous conditions. They had all served in those same remote, dangerous posts that Whitman was threatening to use as punishment. They had all earned their positions through courage and sacrifice rather than political connections. And they understood exactly what their sergeant major was saying about the true source of respect and authority. The ribbons and decorations displayed on their uniforms told stories that Whitman couldn't begin to comprehend. Tales of nighttime raids in hostile territory, of convoy operations through areas controlled by enemy forces, of humanitarian missions in disaster zones where military personnel were often the only barrier between civilian populations and chaos or death. Each medal and ribbon represented months or years of service in conditions that tested every aspect of their character and commitment. General Morrison stepped forward from her position near the building entrance, unable to remain silent any longer as she watched a decorated combat veteran being subjected to public humiliation by a politician who had never worn a uniform or understood the true cost of military service. Her 32 years of military experience had taught her to recognize critical moments in civil-military relations, and she could see that this confrontation was approaching a point of no return that could have lasting consequences for everyone involved. "Minister Whitman," General Morrison said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded troops in combat and earned the respect of military personnel throughout the system. Perhaps this discussion would be better continued in private, away from public scrutiny and the potential for misunderstanding. The Royal Guard has an exemplary service record that speaks for itself, and Sergeant Major Fletcher is one of our most decorated and respected non-commissioned officers. Her intervention was carefully worded to provide Whitman with a face-saving exit from a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his control, but it also served as a subtle reminder that his behavior was being witnessed and judged by military professionals who understood the difference between legitimate civilian oversight and petty political harassment. Whitman whirled around to face the general, his composure completely shattered now as he realized that his authority was being questioned not just by enlisted personnel, but by senior military officers who outranked him in experience and professional credibility, if not in political appointment. His carefully planned demonstration of civilian supremacy was turning into a public relations disaster that would follow him for the rest of his political career. "General Morrison," Whitman's voice cracked with barely controlled fury, "this is exactly the problem I'm trying to address here today. This unit thinks they're above civilian authority. They think their military service gives them the right to pick and choose which orders they'll follow based on their personal interpretation of honor and dignity." He gestured wildly toward the formation of guards, his expensive briefcase swinging dangerously close to Fletcher's face in a move that could have been interpreted as deliberately threatening. These soldiers seemed to believe that their combat experience exempts them from showing proper respect to the civilian leadership that controls their careers and their futures in this organization. General Morrison's expression hardened as she recognized the full extent of Whitman's misunderstanding of military culture and civil-military relations. "Minister, that's not what's happening here, and I think you know it," she replied with the kind of diplomatic firmness that came from years of dealing with difficult political situations while maintaining military professionalism. "These soldiers understand the difference between lawful orders and public humiliation," she continued, her voice carrying across the courtyard so that all the observers could hear her words clearly. "What you're demanding isn't military protocol or legitimate civilian oversight. It's a power play designed to humiliate combat veterans for your own political satisfaction." The crowd of observers had grown even larger, and several people were now openly recording the confrontation with their smartphones and cameras. Government employees, visiting officials, military personnel from other units, And even some members of the press, who had been in the building for unrelated business, had gathered too. Witnessed this unprecedented clash between civilian and military authority. Among the observers were family members of military personnel who happened to be visiting the building, contractors and civilian employees who worked closely with military units, and even some tourists who had been taking a guided tour of the government district when the confrontation began. The diversity of the audience meant that whatever happened next would be seen and discussed by people throughout the civilian and military communities. Whitman realized he was losing control of the situation as he looked around at the faces of the people. Watching his confrontation with Fletcher and Morrison, some showed obvious disapproval of his behavior. Others appeared fascinated by the unprecedented nature of what they were witnessing. And still others seemed to be documenting everything for later analysis and discussion. His political survival instincts finally began to overcome his wounded pride as he understood the potential consequences of this very public dispute. Videos of a government minister being lectured by military personnel about honor and dignity would not play well in the media. With his political superiors, or with the voting public that ultimately controlled his political future. But instead of recognizing the graceful exit that General Morrison had offered him, Whitman's arrogance and need to assert dominance drove him to escalate the confrontation even further. "I'm ordering you one final time," he shouted at Fletcher, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the surrounding buildings and carrying 2 observers throughout the courtyard. "Render honors immediately, or face the consequences of defying a direct order from the Minister of Defense." The ultimatum hung in the air like a sword, its implications clear to everyone present. Whitman had just forced Fletcher into a position where he would have to choose between maintaining his principles and potentially sacrificing his career. Between preserving his dignity and protecting his soldiers from political retaliation, Fletcher looked directly at Whitman for the first time during the entire confrontation, his weathered face showing no fear or hesitation despite the gravity of the situation and the potential consequences of his next words. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every battle he had fought, every soldier he had served alongside, and every principle he had sworn to uphold when he first put on the uniform. "Minister," Fletcher said quietly, his words carrying clearly in the tense silence that had fallen over the courtyard. "I have saluted officers who led from the front in combat, who shared our dangers and earned our trust through their actions rather than their appointments. I have rendered honors to leaders who understood that respect flows from character, not from titles or threats or budget authority." He paused, looking directly into Whitman's eyes, with the steady gaze of someone who had faced far greater dangers than career destruction, and had never backed down from a fight when principle was at stake. "You want a salute from me and my soldiers? Then earn it." The tension in the courtyard reached a breaking point as Minister Whitman stepped even closer to Sergeant Major Fletcher, his face now flushed with embarrassment and rage. He had expected immediate compliance, not a lesson in military ethics from someone he considered a subordinate. "You're testing my patience, Sergeant Major," Whitman hissed, his voice low but carrying clearly in the morning air. "I have the authority to end your career with a single phone call. I can transfer this entire formation to the most remote, miserable posts in the military. Is that really the hill you want to die on?" Fletcher remained perfectly still, but his response was immediate and unwavering. "Sir, I've already been to those remote, miserable posts. I've served in places where good soldiers die for causes they believe in. I've earned my rank through service to my country, not through political appointments or budget negotiations." A murmur rippled through the growing crowd of observers. Fletcher had just delivered what amounted to a devastating critique of Whitman's qualifications, without technically showing disrespect to his office. Corporal Chen and the other guards remained motionless, but their solidarity with Fletcher was unmistakable. They had all served in those same dangerous places Fletcher referenced. They had all earned their positions through courage and sacrifice. And they understood exactly what their sergeant major was saying. General Morrison stepped forward, unable to remain silent any longer. "Minister Whitman, perhaps this discussion would be better continued in private. The Royal Guard has an exemplary service record. And Sergeant Major, Fletcher is one of our most decorated non-commissioned officers." Whitman whirled around to face the general, his composure completely shattered now. "General Morrison, This is exactly the problem I'm trying to address. This unit thinks they're above civilian authority. They think their military service gives them the right to pick and choose which orders they'll follow. That's not what's happening here, sir, Morrison replied firmly. These soldiers understand the difference between lawful orders and public humiliation. What you're demanding isn't military protocol, it's a power play. The crowd of observers had grown larger, and several people were now openly recording the confrontation. Government employees, visiting officials, and even some members of the press who happened to be in the building had gathered to witness this unprecedented clash between civilian and military leadership. Whitman realized he was losing control of the situation, but his pride prevented him from backing down. "I'm ordering you one final time," he shouted at Fletcher, his voice echoing off the building walls. "Render honors immediately, or face the consequences of defying a direct order from the Minister of Defense." Fletcher looked directly at Whitman for the first time during the confrontation, his weathered face showing no fear or hesitation. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of every battle he had fought, every soldier he had served alongside, and every principle he had sworn to uphold. "Minister, I have saluted officers who led from the front in combat, who shared our dangers and earned our trust through their actions. I have rendered honors to leaders who understood that respect flows from character, not from titles or threats." The sergeant major paused, letting his words sink in before delivering his final statement. "You want a salute from me? Then earn it." The silence that followed Fletcher's words was deafening. A complete absence of sound that seemed to stretch across not just the courtyard, but the entire government district surrounding them. Every person present understood they had just witnessed something extraordinary, a moment when principle collided with power and principle stood its ground without flinching, when moral courage faced down political authority and refused to be intimidated or compromised. The morning sun had reached its full intensity, casting sharp, unforgiving light across the scene and eliminating every shadow that might have provided concealment or ambiguity. There was nowhere to hide from what had just transpired. No way to minimize or reinterpret Fletcher's challenge to Whitman's authority. The sergeant major had drawn a line in the sand and dared a government minister to cross it, knowing full well the potential consequences for his career and his soldiers. Minister Whitman's face cycled through several shades of red as the full impact of Fletcher's statement hit him like a physical blow. He had been publicly challenged by a non-commissioned officer in front of dozens of witnesses, including senior military officers, government employees, members of the press, and civilians who had certainly discussed this confrontation throughout their communities. More importantly, he had been found wanting in a test of leadership and character that he himself had initiated. His political instincts screamed at him to assert his authority through immediate punishment, to use every tool at his disposal to crush Fletcher and make an example of what happened to military personnel who dared to challenge civilian leadership. He could have Fletcher transferred to the most remote post in the military system, could ensure that his service record reflected insubordination and disrespect, could make certain that the sergeant major never received another promotion or commendation. But something in Fletcher's calm dignity and unwavering moral courage gave Whitman pause, forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own character and qualifications that he had spent months avoiding through bureaucratic maneuvering and political positioning. The sergeant major hadn't just challenged his authority, he had exposed the fundamental weakness and insecurity that drove Whitman's need to dominate and humiliate. Others, the other guards in the formation, remained perfectly still, but their unity with their sergeant major was unmistakable to anyone who understood military culture and the bonds forged between soldiers who had served together in dangerous conditions. They had all been in situations where Fletcher's leadership meant the difference between life and death, where his judgment and courage had kept them alive, and mission-focused despite overwhelming odds and constant danger. Each of these soldiers had stories that would have humbled most civilians, tales of carrying wounded comrades through hostile territory, of holding defensive positions against overwhelming enemy forces, of making split-second decisions that saved lives and completed missions despite personal risk and sacrifice. They had served under true leaders in life and death situations, and they recognized authentic leadership when they saw it, just as they could identify its absence in those who confused authority with respect. General Morrison stepped closer to both men, her 3 decades of military experience giving her the wisdom to recognize a defining moment in civil-military relations when she witnessed one. She had seen similar confrontations before, had watched weak leaders destroy their own credibility through arrogance and ignorance, and she understood that how this situation was resolved would have lasting consequences for everyone involved. "Gentlemen," Morrison said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded troops in combat and earned respect through competence rather than political appointment. "The eyes of this entire organization are on us right now. How we handle this situation will be remembered and discussed long after today's emotions have faded and everyone has moved on to other assignments." Her words were carefully chosen to provide both men with a path toward resolution that preserved dignity for everyone involved. But they also served as a warning about the potential consequences of escalating this confrontation further. Morrison had seen careers destroyed and institutions damaged by moments of poor judgment and wounded pride, and she was determined to prevent such an outcome if possible. Whitman looked around at the crowd of observers that had gathered to witness this unprecedented clash between civilian and military authority. The audience had grown to include dozens of people from throughout the government complex and beyond, each recording or remembering details that would certainly be shared and analyzed throughout the military and political communities. Among the faces in the crowd, Whitman could see government employees who would report back to their supervisors about his behavior, military officers who would discuss this incident with their colleagues and subordinates, journalists who had stumbled onto what could become a significant news story, and civilians whose opinions of government leadership would be shaped by what they had witnessed. For the first time since becoming Minister of Defense, Charles Whitman began to look at Sergeant Major Fletcher as a human being rather than as a budget item or a political obstacle. He saw the ribbons on the man's chest, each representing months or years of service in the world's most dangerous places. He noticed the small scars on Fletcher's hands, probably from shrapnel or combat debris collected during firefights in distant countries. He observed the way the other guards looked to Fletcher for leadership, not out of fear or military hierarchy, but out of genuine respect earned through shared hardship and demonstrated competence. The realization began slowly, like dawn breaking over a landscape that had been hidden by darkness. These weren't political props or expensive decorations consuming budget resources unnecessarily. These were combat veterans who had sacrificed more for their country than most people could imagine, who had served in places and situations that Whitman had only read about in briefing. "Documents and intelligence reports," Sergeant Major Whitman said slowly, his voice much quieter than it had been throughout the entire confrontation. Stripped of the arrogance and condescension that had characterized his earlier statements, "Tell me about those ribbons on your chest. I want to understand what they represent." Fletcher looked surprised by the question, clearly not expecting this shift in tone from a man who had been threatening his career moments earlier. But his military bearing remained perfect as he answered without hesitation, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone that combat veterans often used when discussing their service. "3 combat deployments, sir," Fletcher replied, his eyes still fixed straight ahead in proper military fashion. "Afghanistan from 2003 to 2004, and again from 2007 to 2008, Iraq from 2009 to 2010, and Syria from 2014 to 2015. Lost 12 good soldiers under my command over those years. Men and women who signed up to serve their country and paid the ultimate price for that commitment. Every ribbon represents people who didn't make it home to their families." The crowd stirred, as they sensed the fundamental shift in the conversation and the atmosphere surrounding it. This was no longer about salutes or protocol or even civilian versus military authority. It had become something much more profound and meaningful. A moment of recognition and understanding that transcended political positioning and bureaucratic power. Struggles. Whitman felt something crack inside his chest as he processed Fletcher's words. really heard them for the first time rather than dismissing them as military posturing or resistance to civilian authority. 12 soldiers. 12 families who had lost sons or daughters, husbands or wives, mothers or fathers, brothers or sisters. 12 funerals where Fletcher had probably stood in dress uniform, presenting folded flags to grieving relatives and knowing that his leadership decisions had played a role in those losses. The weight of that responsibility, the burden of command in life-and-death situations, was something that Whitman had never experienced or truly understood despite his position as Minister of Defense. He had made decisions that affected military personnel, had approved deployments and missions and budget allocations, but always from the comfortable distance of political office, rather than the immediate reality of combat leadership and the other guards. Whitman asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as he began to comprehend the full scope of what he had been dismissing as expensive ceremony and outdated tradition. Do they all have similar stories of service and sacrifice? Fletcher glanced briefly at his fellow guards. A subtle movement that somehow conveyed volumes about the bonds between these soldiers and their shared experiences in the world's most dangerous places. Then returned his gaze to the minister. His voice remained steady and factual, as he began to tell the stories that Whitman had never bothered to learn during his months as their ultimate commanding authority. Every person in this formation has served in combat zones, sir. Often multiple deployments over periods spanning years of continuous service, Fletcher began, his words carrying the weight of genuine respect for his fellow soldiers. Corporal Chen over there pulled 3 wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire during a firefight outside Kabul in Afghanistan. She carried men twice her size through 2 kilometers of hostile territory while taking sporadic sniper fire, never stopping until she got them to medical evacuation. Whitman's eyes moved to Chen, seeing her for the first time as something other than a small woman in a ceremonial uniform. He tried to imagine her carrying wounded soldiers through a war zone, facing enemy fire with the kind of courage he had only read about in military history books and briefing reports. That had seemed abstract and distant until this moment. Private Torres lost his left leg below the knee to an improvised explosive device during a patrol in Iraq, Fletcher continued, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone that military personnel used when discussing wounds and sacrifice that civilians found difficult to comprehend. Instead of accepting a medical discharge and full disability benefits, he fought through 8 months of rehabilitation and retraining to remain on active duty. He said he didn't want to be defined by what he lost, but by what he could still give to his country and his fellow soldiers. The minister looked at Torres, noting for the first time the slight irregularity in his stance that might indicate a prosthetic limb, the subtle sign of sacrifice that Whitman had been too self-absorbed to notice during his previous encounters with the Royal Guard. He felt a growing sense of shame at his own ignorance and insensitivity. Sergeant Williams spent 8 months as a prisoner of war after his reconnaissance unit was captured. During a mission behind enemy lines, Fletcher continued, each revelation hitting Whitman like a physical blow to his understanding of what military service really meant. He endured interrogation, torture, and deprivation that would have broken most people. But he never gave up classified information that could have endangered other soldiers or compromised ongoing operations. When he was finally rescued, he had lost 40 pounds and suffered injuries that still affect him today. Williams stood perfectly still in formation, but Whitman could now see the subtle signs of his ordeal, the slight stiffness in his posture that might indicate old injuries, the 1,000-yard stare that combat veterans sometimes carried, the quiet dignity of someone who had survived experiences that most people couldn't imagine. Corporal Hayes, no relation to the former defense minister, was awarded the Silver Star for leading a rescue mission that saved 12 civilians trapped in a collapsed building during earthquake relief operations in Haiti, Fletcher went on, his voice growing stronger with each story of courage and sacrifice. She crawled through unstable rubble for 6 hours, knowing that the building could collapse further at any moment, because she refused to leave those people to die when there was still a chance to save them. Each revelation was transforming Whitman's understanding of the people he had been treating as expensive ornaments and budget burdens. These weren't political props or ceremonial decorations. They were heroes who had risked everything in service to their country and to humanity itself, who had volunteered for the most dangerous missions and assignments because someone had to do the job and they were willing to pay the price. Staff. Sergeant Rodriguez saved an entire village in Afghanistan by single-handedly holding off an enemy assault for 3 hours while his unit evacuated civilian families. Fletcher continued, his respect and admiration for his fellow soldiers evident in every word. He was wounded twice during that engagement but refused medical evacuation till every civilian was safely out of the combat zone. The enemy outnumbered him 15-1, but he never gave ground. Private Martinez lost both parents in the September 11th attacks and joined the military, specifically to fight terrorism and protect other families from experiencing what his family went through. Fletcher went on, each story adding another layer to Whitman's growing understanding of the true meaning of service and sacrifice. He served for combat deployments in various counter-terrorism operations, always volunteering for the most dangerous missions because he says he has personal reasons to ensure that terrorists never again have the opportunity to attack innocent people. Sergeant Thompson was a medic who saved dozens of lives during her deployments, often exposing herself to enemy fire to reach wounded soldiers. Fletcher continued, his voice carrying the deep respect that combat veterans held for medical personnel who shared their dangers. She was hit by shrapnel during one rescue operation, but continued treating casualties until she collapsed from blood loss. Even then, her first concern was for her patients, not her own injuries. Corporal Jackson volunteered for explosive ordnance disposal after losing 3 friends to roadside bombs in Iraq. Fletcher went on, each story revealing another dimension of courage and commitment that Whitman had never imagined. He's personally disarmed over 200 improvised explosive devices, knowing that one mistake could kill him instantly, but also knowing that leaving those devices in place could kill innocent civilians or his fellow soldiers. The crowd of observers listened in stunned silence as Fletcher painted a picture of collective heroism and sacrifice that put the morning's confrontation into its proper perspective. These weren't insubordinate soldiers defying civilian authority. These were combat veterans defending the dignity and honor they had earned through blood and sacrifice in the service of their country. General Morrison wiped a tear from her eye as she watched a career politician finally beginning to understand the true cost of military service and the character of the people who volunteered to pay that cost. She had seen many civilian leaders struggle to comprehend the reality of military service, but she had never witnessed such a complete transformation of understanding. As what was occurring before her eyes, Minister Whitman felt overwhelmed by the weight of these revelations, by the growing realization of how badly he had misjudged and mistreated people who deserved his deepest respect and gratitude. The comfortable assumptions of his political career that respect was owed to him because of his title and authority, that military personnel were subordinates whose primary purpose was to follow orders without question, were crumbling in the face of these stories of genuine heroism and sacrifice. "I owe you an apology," Whitman said finally, his voice thick with emotion and shame at his own behavior and ignorance. "All of you. I came here today thinking I understood authority and respect and the proper relationship between civilian leadership and military service. I was completely wrong about everything." He turned to face the entire formation of guards, his expensive suit and political trappings suddenly seeming insignificant compared to the ribbons and decorations that told stories of real courage and sacrifice. "I demanded a salute from you because I thought my title and my control over your budgets and careers entitled me to your respect. But Sergeant Major Fletcher was absolutely right. Respect must be earned, not commanded through threats or bureaucratic authority." The minister's next action shocked everyone present, including the guards who had expected punishment rather than recognition, and the civilian observers who had anticipated a political power struggle rather than a moment of genuine leadership and human understanding. Instead of continuing to demand a salute from the guards or asserting his civilian authority over military personnel, Charles Whitman slowly raised his own hand and rendered a perfect salute to Sergeant Major Fletcher and his entire formation. "This salute is for your service," Whitman said, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard with a dignity and sincerity that had been completely absent from his earlier statements. "For the soldiers you've lost and the battles you've fought, for the wounds you've carried and the nightmares you've endured, for the sacrifices you've made that people like me take for granted every single day without ever truly understanding their cost." Fletcher and his guards immediately returned the salute. With the precision and dignity that had characterized their entire military careers, but this exchange was fundamentally different from the confrontation that had preceded it. This wasn't about protocol or chain of command or civilian versus military authority. This was about mutual respect between people who served their country in different ways, but with the same fundamental dedication to something greater than themselves. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, a sound that began tentatively but quickly grew into a thunderous ovation that echoed off the stone buildings surrounding the courtyard. Government workers, visiting officials, military personnel from other units, journalists, and even casual observers who had been drawn by the commotion found themselves applauding not just the resolution of a tense confrontation, but a moment of genuine human connection and understanding that transcended political positioning and bureaucratic power struggles. General Morrison openly wept as she watched a career politician transform into a true leader before her eyes, demonstrating the kind of moral courage and intellectual honesty that she had rarely seen in civilian officials. Minister Whitman had learned something that couldn't be taught in political science classes or budget meetings, or policy seminars, that real authority comes from understanding and honoring the people you serve, not from demanding their submission through threats and intimidation. In the weeks and months that followed this transformative encounter, the ripple effects of what had occurred in the courtyard of the defense headquarters spread throughout the entire government and military establishment. Like waves expanding from a stone dropped into still water, the video recordings made by numerous observers had been shared across social media platforms and news outlets. But rather than becoming a source of embarrassment or scandal, the footage became a powerful example of leadership, courage, and the possibility of genuine understanding between civilian and military communities. Minister. He began spending significant portions of his time visiting military installations, not for ceremonial inspections or political photo opportunities, but to genuinely learn about the experiences and needs of military personnel at every level of the organization. He sat in mess halls listening to the concerns of junior enlisted personnel, attended training exercises to understand the challenges faced by military units, and most importantly, he made it his personal mission to ensure that the human cost of military service was never forgotten in policy. Discussions or budget negotiations. The minister's transformation was particularly evident in his approach to veterans affairs and military family support programs. He established a direct communication channel between his office and military families, ensuring that concerns about deployment conditions, medical care, and family support services reached his desk without being filtered through layers of bureaucracy. When he discovered that some military families were struggling with basic needs while their soldiers served overseas, he personally lobbied Congress for increased family support funding and improved benefits packages. One of his most significant initiatives was the creation of a comprehensive mental health support program for military personnel and veterans dealing with combat-related trauma and adjustment difficulties. Having learned about the psychological wounds that soldiers carried alongside their physical injuries, Whitman worked tirelessly to eliminate the stigma associated with seeking mental health care and to ensure that treatment resources were available to anyone who needed them. The Royal Guard formation that had stood their ground that morning became unofficial ambassadors for Whitman's new understanding of military service. He frequently brought visiting dignitaries and foreign officials to meet with Fletcher and his soldiers, not as ceremonial displays, but as opportunities for civilian leaders to hear first-hand accounts of military, our service, and sacrifice. These interactions often had the same transformative effect on other officials that Fletcher's words had had on Whitman. Sergeant Major Fletcher found himself in an unexpected role as an advisor and educator, helping civilian officials understand the realities of military service and the needs of military communities. His quiet dignity and factual approach to describing combat experiences made him an effective bridge between the military and civilian worlds, and his influence extended far beyond the ceremonial duties of the Royal Guard. The other members of the formation also found their lives changed by the events of that morning. Corporal Chen was selected for officer training and eventually became one of the military's most effective advocates for women in combat roles. Private Torres's story of overcoming disability to continue serving inspired new policies for wounded warriors and led to improved support programs for military personnel dealing with service-related injuries. The incident also had broader implications for civil-military relations throughout the government. Other civilian officials began to approach their interactions with military personnel with greater respect and understanding, recognizing that the soldiers and officers under their authority were not just employees but individuals who had made extraordinary sacrifices for their country. Training programs were developed to help civilian appointees understand military culture and the experiences of the personnel they would be working with. These programs included presentations by combat veterans, visits to military installations, and comprehensive briefings on the history and traditions that shaped military service. The goal was to prevent future confrontations like the one between Whitman and Fletcher by ensuring that civilian leaders understood and respected the people they served alongside. General Morrison, who had witnessed the transformation of Minister Whitman firsthand, became a strong advocate for improved civil-military relations and worked to establish formal mentorship programs pairing experienced military officers with newly appointed civilian officials. Her efforts helped create a culture of mutual respect and understanding that strengthened both civilian oversight and military effectiveness. The courtyard, where the confrontation had taken place, became an informal gathering point for military personnel and civilian employees who wanted to discuss the lessons learned from that remarkable morning. A small plaque was eventually installed, commemorating not the confrontation itself, but the understanding and respect that had emerged from it. The inscription read simply, "Respect is earned through service, sacrifice, and character." Years later, when Charles Whitman's term as Minister of Defense came to an end, his farewell ceremony was held in that same courtyard where he had once demanded submission and instead found wisdom. Hundreds of military personnel and civilian employees gathered to honor a leader who had demonstrated that true strength comes not from asserting authority over others, but from understanding and serving those who have already given so much. Sergeant Major Fletcher, now promoted to the highest enlisted rank in his service branch, delivered remarks at the ceremony that captured the essence of what had been learned that day. True leadership is not about commanding respect, but about earning it. It's not about having power over others, but about using whatever power you have to serve something greater than yourself. The Royal Guard, still maintaining their ceremonial duties with the same precision and dignity they had always shown, rendered honors to Minister Whitman as he departed office. But this time the salute was given freely, gladly, and with genuine respect for a leader who had proven himself worthy of their regard through his actions and his character rather than through his title and authority. The lesson of that autumn morning continued to resonate throughout the military and civilian communities, long after the principals had moved on to other roles and responsibilities. The story was told in leadership training courses, cited in academic studies of civil-military relations, and passed down through informal networks of military personnel and government employees as an example of how conflict can lead to understanding when people are willing to listen to each other and recognize their shared humanity. The confrontation that had begun with demands for submission had ended with mutual respect, proving that even the most difficult situations can be transformed when people choose courage over convenience, principle over politics, and understanding over authority. In a world often divided by differences in background, experience, and perspective, the encounter between Minister Whitman and Sergeant Major Fletcher stood as a powerful reminder that respect and dignity are universal values that transcend rank, position, and political appointment. The Royal Guard continued their duties, serving as living symbols of military excellence and national service. But they did so with the knowledge that their sacrifice was understood and valued by those who held power over their fate. And Charles Whitman, who had sought respect through dominance and found it through humility, left office with a legacy far greater than any political achievement he might have imagined when he first stepped out of his sedan that transformative morning and months that followed. Minister Whitman would become known throughout the government and military communities as one of the strongest advocates for military personnel and veterans, affairs that the Defense Department had ever seen. He fought tirelessly for better veterans' benefits and improved equipment funding, but more importantly, he championed policies that recognized the human cost of military service and treated military personnel as the heroes they were, rather than as budget line items or political tools. The confrontation that could have destroyed his political career instead became the defining moment that gave his life and work real meaning and purpose. The Royal Guard continued their ceremonial duties with the same dignity and professionalism they had always shown, but now they did so knowing that their sacrifices were truly understood and appreciated by the civilian leadership that held power over their fate and their futures. The salute they had refused to give when it was commanded as a display of political dominance, they now gave freely out of genuine respect for a leader who had earned it through moral courage and intellectual humility. And Charles Whitman, who had sought respect through authority and threats, finally received it through understanding and service to those who had already given so much for their country. That followed, Minister Whitman would become known as one of the military's strongest advocates in government. He fought for better veterans' benefits, improved equipment funding, and most importantly, policies that recognized the human cost of military service. The confrontation that could have destroyed his career instead became the moment that defined it. The Royal Guard continued their ceremonial duties with the same dignity and professionalism they had always shown, but now they did so knowing that their sacrifices were truly understood and appreciated by those who held power over their fate. The salute they had refused to give when commanded, they now gave freely out of respect for a leader who had earned it.